we think it's fitting to be in the Morse Auditorium, which is a synagogue on Passover. So welcome. My name is Lynn Allen, and I'm the director of the School of Visual Arts, who's hosting Yvonne Rainer and Rob Storr. But before we start, I'd like to ask you all to turn off your cell phones or to put them on vibrate, and also tell you that perhaps even during the course of the conversation, you can ask questions, but at the end, for sure, there will be a person in either aisle with a microphone if you'd like to ask any questions of either of our guests. I'll start with Rob Storr. Rob Storr's accomplishments span the art world as a curator, academic, critic, and painter. Rob received his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and has gone on to teach painting at such prestigious schools as RISD, Tyler Art School, and Harvard, among others. Formerly curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, he has curated scores of exhibitions and authored dozens of monographs and catalogs. In 2007, he was the director of the Venice Biennale, by the way, the first American director of the Venice Biennale. Presently, he is dean of the Yale School of Art. Last year, Rob was here in conversation with Chuck Close. Our guest tonight is equally as august, and we are thrilled to welcome her. Yvonne Rainer is a choreographer and filmmaker whose work in both disciplines is frequently challenging and experimental. Although she moved to New York to study theater, she was drawn to modern dance and studied at the Martha Graham School and later with Merce Cunningham. Her approach to dance influenced what later became standard features of modern dance. Rainer sometimes included film sequences in her dances, and in the mid-'70s turned her attention to film directing, going against convention to combine reality and fiction, sound and visuals, and focusing on social and political issues. In 1990, Yvonne Rainer was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Rob Storr and Yvonne Rainer to Boston University.
Okay, comfortable? What I think we're going to do is the following, and Yvonne may change courses, and it is her right to do so, but I would just say a couple of words at the outset. We have 4 clips of work of different types and different times to show, and she will be the disc jockey or film jockey or whatever in terms of that goes. But it'll basically be a conversation between us about those things and other things. And as Lynn said, it's open for interventions whenever, and certainly will be open for questions and responses at the end. I would just beg of you to, since we do have a relatively small amount of time, and since we have somebody who's very important to listen to, that you make your statements not excessively long, that it really be a give and take. I would just like to say that it's a great pleasure to do this. Yvonne and I have known each other on and off over quite a long time. When we first met was the early 80s, which is to say that almost the tail end of the late 70s, which was a very, very different time than what we've gone through in recent years, and probably more resembles what we're about to go into than what we've been through recently, an art world where the terms of making art are often against a background which is very unsettled, very uncertain. And I was going to just sort of begin by saying that it seems to me striking, and since this is a student audience predominantly, that for the past 15, 20 years, people have talked a great deal about careers, as if there was some kind of scripted narrative or scripted scenario for how one begins in one place and ends up in some ideal, point. But it seems to me that art has always been much more about working than about careers, and about specific work that one chooses. And since Yvonne has, as Lynn explained, done many things, perhaps one of the starting points might be exactly that, how you have chosen to work in this way and chosen to work in that way, and how the patterns developed rather than how the patterns were foretold. And I wonder if you could maybe...
In a nutshell, I kind of fell into dance in the late 50s, and I feel very privileged to have come into the field at a very crucial moment when everything in the art and music, dance worlds was about to explode in different directions and reinvent the terms and the boundaries of art making. So by 1960, I was studying with Merce Cunningham, who of course was the longtime collaborator with John Cage, who redefined the rules or threw them out about what constituted music. And I began to use chance procedures, which came directly from John Cage's methods for organizing sounds. And by 1965, I was thinking about an evening-length work. I had studied composition with Robert Dunn, who was an acolyte of Cage's, played the piano for Cunningham classes, technique classes, and he exposed to us these different methods for making dances, organizing movement, looking to other sources of movement than one's own body, for instance. So by 1965, I was thinking about a long dance called The Mind is a Muscle, and the first section of that dance was called Trio A, which has become my signature dance, partly because it's the only, it's one of the few surviving records of my work from a 15-year career. It's a 5-minute piece. It was originally done as a trio by 3 people doing it in and out of phase. It was not meant to be in perfect unison. And a film was made of me doing it in 1978. I still teach it, and various people, I don't know whether hundreds, but a large number of people have learned it in various situations, and it continues to be taught. So Craig, we will see Trio A, which is top of that list. It was originally filmed in 16 millimeter. That's the Academy leader. Maybe I can save time by talking about it as you watch it. One of the main characteristics of this dance is that the gaze of the performer never looks directly out at the audience. And I'd begun to question my own enjoyment and what I termed a kind of narcissism and pleasure in being looked at as a performer. and the symbiotic relation of being looked at and looking seemed to reinforce this kind of exhibitionism, which is the way I termed it at the time. So I refused to look at the audience. So the gaze becomes inward. I'm either looking at my own body or anticipating where a part of my body is going to go. Or if my body faces the audience, my head, I gave special movements for my head, like rolling around, which has already happened, as the body moves sideways across the space. Here, I have just done a backward somersault, and as I come up, my eyes are closed. So to continue this, another aspect is that I give equal attention to every movement. No one movement is any more important than any other, which required a certain kind of distribution of energy. Very simple things and very difficult things are given the same weight and unmodulated dynamic. What? It was originally done to the accompaniment of 3-foot-long slats that were thrown down from a choir loft at Judson Church, and they piled up on one side of the space. It's also been done to the Chambers Brothers in the midnight hour. That's about it. It's usually done now in silence.
Are all the movements set, or is there improvisation going on at some points in the piece?
Could you repeat that?
Is there improvisation going on at certain points in the piece?
No, there's no improvisation
It's all
at all. Yeah, everything is set. Yeah, preset. I think, have we gotten into the details or? Yeah, so we can stop. It's, yeah.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the context in which this was made and where the movements themselves came from? Did they have specific references, or were they things that emanated from previous exercises, or from what kinds of?
It was various sources, mainly from just inventing out of my training, and there are no specific exercises. I was in a dialogue with ballet, so there are like 3 arabesques in it. They're very, people think it's easy to do. It's a very technical dance, a lot of one-legged balances. There's a lot of patting your head and rubbing your belly kinds of coordinations. So it was about a kind of accretion of simple tasks, like for the head, but then at the same time there's a pattern, a traveling pattern for the feet. So I just kept trying to make things either very simple, like the beginning is just this, or complicated. And the idea, as I progressed, I made it in chronological, I mean, it stands in the order in which I made the moves. As it progressed, I realized I was into something about this even dynamic, no attack, no hierarchy of movements, and that I pursued. Yeah, I worked on it for 6 months. It's 5 minutes came out of that, so I was pretty particular about the choices I made, but it's hard to remember exactly where each movement came from. I mean, there are ordinary things like a somersault and some things I let go on, like where you're looking down, and the idea is to get your nose on your toe. In teaching it to some of the original performers of it, I remember David Gordon, I asked him, there was some way he was doing something, and it seemed very mannered to me. I said, "What's your image?" He said, I'm thinking of myself as a faun, F-A-U-N, and a mythical character or animal. And I said, well, try thinking of yourself as a barrel. I mean, I had more material, inanimate things in mind. There was another one, someone was doing a move like a bird. I said, no, think of an airplane, right? So it went like that.
Now, when it was performed, you said the first time it was done by a group of, I think, 4 dancers, right?
3.
3 dancers.
3.
And each started at a different time.
No, we started more or less at the same time.
Oh, really?
But I left the pace up to each one.
I thought it was
yeah.
kind of like a musical canon where it was staggered.
No, not. It's never exact like
Okay,
that.
okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But given those parameters, can you talk a little bit about, in a sense, what you were pushing off from, that to do things where you didn't have sort of crescendos or dramatic, effects or accents and so on. What were you thinking about, and what were you thinking about not doing?
I was not going to repeat, although the walking, the only repetition is walking to connect things. I guess that even registration or modulation, whatever, what did that come out of? It came out of Lamont Young, perhaps. Some of the things that were being done in music came out of yeah, Cage's notions of silence. It came out of the unpredictability. Like one of the first things Steve Paxton, a colleague choreographer, said to me was, you can't predict what is going to happen next. So it didn't come out of a sense of organic continuity that much modern dance, fall and recovery of Doris Humphrey and these various techniques that had animated previous modern dance. So I definitely had a dialogue with my predecessors and as well as with ballet.
And at that time, you were in the context and really part of the Judson Theater dance project. And at that time, you had artists collaborating, the Judson Theater, not you personally necessarily, but the Judson Theater had artists collaborating. Robert Morris did things, Rauschenberg did things, and so on. What was your relationship to the visual artists who were entering into the world that had previously been dance as performers?
It was a time of great cross-fertilization. Painters were making happenings. Dancers were in music, were performing in musical compositions. I mean, everyone was crossing the boundaries, and everyone went to the latest. The Judson Church had a gallery where Alan Capro and Oldenburg first showed their work. Then there was the Rubin Gallery where the happenings of Jim Dine and Oldenburg took place. There's a 92nd Street Y where Cage presented his work. So it was a much smaller audience from different fields, and everyone went to everything. So it was a very heightened sense of expectation in the air, and
there was one specific performance that you did in relation to the flag show at the Judson Church, which was a show using the American flag, which was very controversial because it was banned and so on, where each of the dancers wore a flag but otherwise wore nothing.
Right.
And the eroticism of some of the choreography that you did is very striking, and it's also striking in contrast to the de-eroticism or de-eroticization of other performances. And in as much as you were thinking about being looked at and being a performer for, could you talk about the sort of sexual politics or also viewer politics?
I guess there's a kind of contradiction there to take off my clothes and perform nude when I had just made a dance that removed me from the gaze of the audience in a certain way. But the Judson Flag Show was about a protest against censorship, and so I was thinking censorship of the body, and of so my normal proclivities against exhibitionism were trumped by the political implications of the flag and nudity, and combining those two things. Yeah.
Did you then go through a sort of process of gradual disenchantment with performing and being a performer, of being looked at and so on? And if so, how did that come about?
Well, we're now getting into a transition to film. I guess I began to chafe at the limitations of the kind of movement that I was capable of and interested in, which was not about storytelling. It was not, did not have, it was not about metaphor. I mean, it was very much influenced by minimalism, and feminism was coming along, and I was reading all these essays about patriarchy, and I began to think about narrative and film, which I had followed experimental film from the 50s when I was in San Francisco as a very young person. I'd seen the films of Maya Deren at the San Francisco Museum of Art as early as 1953. And so when I came to New York in 56, I was still following film, experimental film. And by the mid-60s and early 70s, Warhol was making films, and there was this movement that was called the New American Cinema, Hollis Frampton and Michael Snow. And I began to see the possibilities for combining some of these experimental techniques in 16 millimeter film with narrative fragments, which brings us to my first feature film, Lives of Performers, in 1972. Shall we go for it? Okay, Craig. With sound.
But Fernando is very confused. He doesn't know what she's talking about. She really confused him. He loses the track of the issues all the time. He only asks, why don't you come with me? But the only answer that he gets is, do you have any money?
That comes a little later. There.
She says, do you have any money?
Valda is disconsolate. She's remembering a visit to John's house. It was in the country. She enjoyed the fresh air, the flowers and the birds, food, vegetables from the garden. She said it was so beautiful, she thinks maybe she'd like to live there forever. She talks about a movie they saw together. They both cried. There was an old woman in the film whose performance affected her very deeply. As usual, John had turned critical when they left the theater and deemed his previous opinion sentimental. She's used to this kind of response in him. You might describe it that way, Valda replies. It's also a story about a man who loves a woman and can't leave her when he falls in love with another woman. I mean, he can't seem to make up his mind. Or I could tell it from the point of view of the first woman. She loves him and endures his cruelties, Yes, cruelties. You see, from her vantage point, his weaknesses become cruelties. Yes, endures his cruelties because he always returns to her. And although she won't acknowledge it, she really does think, no, feel, that she can't live without him. How did she ever get into such a fix? She also thinks that he loves her best and that love will finally conquer all. After all, he always returns to her, doesn't he? Or I could tell it through the eyes of number 2 woman. She loves him and wants him to leave number 1. She even gets pregnant. Then her own husband demands a divorce. He's had enough. How did she ever get herself into such a fix? But I don't care to dwell on number 2. How can such things continue to happen? As I said before, he can't make up his mind. Then number 1 gets sick, so he stays with her but doesn't give up number 2. Or rather, number 2 doesn't leave him. I don't want to make it sound as though he holds the controls, even though the 2 women sometimes act as though he does.
Which woman is the director most sympathetic to?
I think number 1. Maybe simply because she appears first.
Okay. There are a lot of things happening there. You have my dance background, this very simple, that here becomes embodiment of the spoken story about a man who can't make up his mind between 2 women. You have this kind of disingenuousness. I mean, I came to this material with a consciousness of Hollywood melodrama, but also of a kind of absurdity, maybe from my background in theater, looking at Ionesco and certainly looking at Godard films. Also, you throughout the film, there's no sync sound. The performers went by their own names, Shirley and Valda, Fernando, and I gave them the pages from the script, which was very disjunctive, and I said, oh, this passage I really liked the way I've written it, so just read it, or improvise. So in that big close-up of Valda, her voiceover, she's improvising this story about going to John's house, making it up as she goes along. Then there's there was a performance that preceded the film, or was concurrent with my editing of the film. And a rough cut of the film was shown during this, as part of this performance, and we sat in front of it and read or improvised from the script, pretty much what you heard here. And that was recorded, and that became the soundtrack for the, so you also hear the audience response. They laugh, and I could have put in a laugh track. It didn't occur to me, but it's the actual audience at the dance concert that you hear. And us also laughing at certain moments, like, it wasn't in here, but when Shirley, there was a previous sound taping as the performers watched themselves for the first time in a private screening, and we recorded their responses. So at a certain point, there's a big close-up of Shirley, And she says, "Oh, I look like an old-fashioned movie star." She'd never seen herself on film before. So I incorporated these spontaneous things into the soundtrack.
Well, one of the sort of principal things that happens as you describe the performance with film and stage is that two things come together that you seem to have been working with all along, which is the framing of time and the framing of space. And that in theater, the space is essentially here. We've been watching a film of you dance, but I've seen live dances where the framework is however big the room is, and whether it has chairs or not. And in Judson, people walked through the dance space to get to it. And then the framing within the frame of the film is a different thing entirely.
Yes. And it was framing, the possibility for very exact framing of the body that was one of the things that drew me to film. Yeah.
And the framing of sound or deframing of sound is the same thing. I mean, breaking the synchronization is another way of deframing sound.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can't do that in live theater. Yeah.
Which brings me to another thing that seems to happen a good deal, which is on the one hand doubling and on the other hand splitting. I mean, you seem to split personalities and also double them so that one is never watching a fully integrated character doing a fully consistent thing. One's always seeing variations.
Right. Yeah.
How did that develop? What kind of a concept or inclination or impulse?
Well, I wasn't interested in illusionistic conventions of narrative cinema as practiced in Hollywood or any kind of narrative film where the sound corresponds to the lips, what actually is coming out of the actor's mouth. I didn't, when I started out, I didn't want to use actors. They gave me either too much or too little. I didn't know how to direct. I still don't know how to direct, but by the time I was through in '96, I was using professional actors. But at this time, I used the people who had worked with me in dance, and some of them were trained dancers, some of them were not. Walter Satterfield was dancing with Merce Cunningham at the time. I had to think about devices for telling a story. And since I wasn't interested in a plot with exposition, development, climax, denouement that followed traditional classical theater, I had to find ways to keep this thing in 90 minutes going with all these fragments of my experience, of things I'd read, quotes, whatever. There are these devices and strategies that I began to explore. All of my films, all 7 of them, deal with some kind of performance or time-based activity. And sometimes it seems the main character is a video artist or a choreographer, dancer, performer, etc. So there are all these performances within the thread or body of the film. In the next one, there are 2 men and 2 women, film about a woman who, and they're referred to only as he and she, so you never know which one is being referred to. So I kept mixing it up so to make these ambiguities in terms of plot, and yet the language I had an air of authenticity about it. I mean, that little story is autobiographical, so and there's a great deal of revamped autobiography in all my films.
In the story of Woman Who, I think the text is roughly, this is the poetically licensed story of a woman who cannot reconcile the facts of her existence with the image of perfection that she has of herself. or it is also the story of the woman who cannot reconcile the facts of her existence with the image of her own deformity or something like that. So you have, again, you have a split personality. It's almost like the archetype of sort of the narcissistic dream of perfection, dream of total.
Right.
Ambivalence.
It's called ambivalence. Yeah.
How consciously did you structure these according to, again, sort of psychological or psychoanalytic models, or how much of this was organically coming out of your own?
It came out of my own development and therapy. Yeah, a lot of it came out of psychotherapy. Yeah, just learning about myself and
There's a film, you're going to show another section in a minute, but in between this and the one you're going to show is a film called The Man Who Envied Women, which is very much about, though, the theorization of sexuality, of identity, a man who becomes a theoretical feminist and yet treats women in ways that would suggest he hadn't studied his own books very well. At what point did theory become a tool and also a mode of expression?
Laura Mulvey's famous essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema and Visual Pleasure, was a kind of lodestone for me at a certain point in the mid-'70s. And the film that came out of that was The Man Who Envied Women, playing, of course, on the penis envy that Freud propagated in relation to women's sexuality, or men's sexuality, castration, and all that. So the theories about certain genres of Hollywood film affected women filmmakers and theorists for the next 20 years or so, or 10 years maybe. And it was a critique of the way women are objectified in 40s and 50s Hollywood movies. So I began collecting clips from Hollywood movies in which women were complicit in this, being demeaned or objectified by men. And these clips became I'm not going to show this film, by the way, but I'm not going to show these clips, but the backdrop for the main character, who was in some kind of therapy, and they were like his cultural unconscious. All these films about, like Bette Davis in Dark Victory, saying to her doctor, "I've been a good girl," and acting like a little girl. What I am going to show is a film from a clip from a Privilege, 1990, which dealt with menopause, female menopause, and race in the same vehicle, which was a very difficult thing to pull off. I nearly gave it up in the middle. I felt as a white woman, a white middle-class woman dealing with characters of color who were also working class. There's a lot of quotation in it from writers, and a lot of printed material that you read. So why don't we go for that one? We're going to have to fast forward through clips of...
While we're fast forwarding, maybe you can talk a little bit about text, because in Story of a Woman Who, there's a scene where the camera comes in on your face and there are words attached to it. And in Dances, we're going to see later on, words have an independent existence in the situation. For you, at what point did sort of light...
This is film about a woman who, I can give you a rundown with the interweaving of text and
Sort of objectified language is then again another element. There's spoken words, and then there's...
Yeah. Oh boy, this is going to take a while, but you'll get a very fast trip through. It can't go any faster, huh? Yeah, VHS. Well, maybe we'll do The Man Who Envied Women, whatever comes up first. This is Christina Talking Pictures. Oh, this is The Man Who Envied Women. Should we look at that or Privilege? Both? Okay. All right, let's go back a little. Yeah. Wait, go back to the title. Yeah, okay. Oh, nice. We can go forward. This one was about a lion tamer, so the characters throwing chairs around.
When I married her, I said to myself, this is serious business. She has a daughter. We'll be a family. I felt very adult. But can a man not be genuinely in love with more than one woman at the same time, especially a man who expects nothing more than the privilege of loving them and always being devoted and kind? I'm not an average man. There's nothing predatory about me. I'm much more of a giver than a receiver. I don't think the sexual act is so terribly important, but I do think that tenderness and compassion are vastly important. My former sister-in-law used to say that I was the most wonderful husband a woman ever had. But isn't that just because I loved my first wife so much that after she died, I loved all gracious and tender women? I suppose that after a man has been married for almost 21 years, to a woman he adored, becomes a lover of all women. And is forever seeking, even though he doesn't know it, something he has lost. You can never cheapen a woman. No man of my sort ever thinks of her exactly as she thinks of herself. After all, her body is to her a familiar thing. But to some men, it's always a sort of a shrine. Women are very subtle in these things. For hundreds and hundreds of years, they had to please men with their charm and their looks and so forth. Inevitably, it must have left somewhere in their brains a deep intelligence about sex, because once that was all they had. Women have to be treated with great tenderness, consideration.
No, I never loved you, Walter, not you or anybody.
Because they're women.
I'm rotten to the heart. I used you just as you said. That's all you ever meant to me. Until a minute ago, when I couldn't fire that second shot. I never thought that could happen to me.
Sorry, baby, I'm not buying.
I'm not asking you to buy. Just hold me close.
Goodbye, baby.
I have never known a woman who in any way disgusted me or made me feel cheap. Just as, to my knowledge, I've never made a woman feel cheap. Sometimes, afterwards, they would suddenly burst into sobs and tears, That would frighten me terribly. But then they would explain that it was purely an emotional reaction and not because they felt ashamed. God, how little any man can know about women.
Family life. How odd that it's sometimes so hard to think clearly about my family, or what passed for a family. Jack, Alicia, myself. Now other people's families, like my brother's, are another matter.
Hi, Tricia. How are you?
Donald, well, speak of the devil. How am I? Well, considering my incisional hernia, my edema, my cystic breasts, my uterine fibroids, my absorption problems, my blind loop syndrome, my non-symptomatic gallstones, my varicose veins, and my deteriorating cervical disc, I guess I'm doing okay. How are you?
Barbara and I went to see Eustachia's mother in the whore last night.
Oh, yeah? What'd you think?
We talked about it for over an hour afterwards. It made me extremely uneasy. You know, usually Barbara holds my hand during movies. This time I held on to hers. Jean-Pierre Léaud's character was too close for comfort.
Donald, you're too damn hard on yourself. As far as behavior goes, there's nothing in your life that resembles his in that movie.
Oh, I know that. Like he never washed the dishes because it would give him too much satisfaction. I love to clean up, and I do it because it gives me lots of satisfaction. No, I'm not talking about the obvious things like when he acts like a bad child. Remember where he walks across the bed with his shoes on? God, wasn't that awful? If you know how dirty Paris streets are. No, I'm talking about the way he's always acting. I mean, putting on an act. And what's really going on is his terror, which he never confronts, and which he's always running away from.
What are you afraid of?
I guess what everyone else is afraid of.
You didn't answer my question.
You know, I didn't think about the film immediately after, but later when we talked...
Oh, hi, Barbara. How long have you been on the extension?
I don't understand the title. It's so superficial.
That's the key to the whole thing. The Mother and the Whore. Donald, there's this book you'd be interested in by Dorothy Dinnerstein, and another by Nancy Chodorov.
Oh, don't give him any more books to read.
Barbara.
The issues the film raises are the same ones I'm going to be dealing with, but I don't want to create a man you'd love to hate.
What's his name again, Jack?
Deller. A euphemism for tell her.
Why not use Teller? Jack Teller.
Too close to the father of the hydrogen bomb.
But why not bring in that association? The H-bomb is as relevant to the sexual...
I'm going to say goodbye now, Tricia.
Bye,
Take care.
Barbara. That's what I was trying to tell you about those books. The trauma for the infant in having to give up that first sense of harmony with the mother is much greater for the male than for the female and results in both the mother-whore syndrome and the H-bomb. Men spend their lives alternating between punishing and seeking mothering from women and carry their rage and terror out of the family realm and into the public.
Why the name Jack?
Barbara, you're still there. Well, it's about good old Anglo-Saxon rhymes. The house that Jack built, Jack Sprat could eat no fat, little Jack Horner sat in a corner, Jack and Jill went up the hill, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick.
Get in and out with your big fat prick.
Hey, did you make that up?
Of course he did.
Maybe I will call him Jack Teller.
Just don't send him any more books.
Barbara, I'm going to hop on the next 747 and come out there and kill you with axe.
Okay. All right. There's a lot going on there. I realize I've been compared to Woody Allen. I mean, just the way characters talk about movies and they're educated and they, you know. liberal, and yeah. So the more feminist theory comes in, rather, which seems in the light of the last 8 years, rather simplified about what produces war, and Dorothy Dinnerstein and Nancy Chodorow. So I was reading these books, and The Night of the Living Dead is that what's playing in the background at the end there. I had gone to a midnight screening of that, and George Romero, maybe you know this film, it's a horror movie, and at the end of it, the lights came up in the theater, and two guys were going at each other in the front row. They were just belting each other. So it was in my mind, the power of that kind of horror, which is about a black man defending people from these monsters who come back from the dead, the undead. Interesting. Anyway, so there's one of my Jack Dellers. Two actors play the same character, and I did end up calling him Jack Deller. And there is the main character, Trisha. That's Trisha Brown dancing at the beginning. She has split up with him, and so she is like the unseen. I took her physical presence out of the picture, influenced by these critiques of the over-sexualization of Hollywood movies, women in Hollywood movies. And so I said, okay, I'll take her out totally, and she'll be a controlling voice, as in very often a man's voice is the controlling voice in film noir. And so there's this telephone conversation with her brother and her sister-in-law, who obviously she doesn't get along with, which was not my case. I got along fine with my sister-in-law. But I do have a brother, and I had this conversation with him after seeing The Mother and the Whore, the French film, which I found very powerful. So there's this conversation about one film, you're seeing another film, and you're seeing the whole audience for that film getting very riled up and fighting in the theater. And
do you want to go to privilege, or should we go to
I don't know.
ROS?
Do we have time?
Some, yeah.
Yeah?
We could do
okay,
that.
let's go to the next
Yeah,
clip.
okay. Because this is the one that is political in a different dimension.
Yeah.
White women always manage to use their own victim status as a way of pleading innocent to the charge of racism. But she's enjoying life in that exclusive white building right along with you. So please, get your ass back in the apartment. You have more work to do.
No, I can't. I just can't. I'll only fall deeper into the soup.
Hey, that's a new note. Self-pity.
Don't expect me to get it right. Just telling you this story in its barest form took all of my gumption. I'm scared of you now in ways I never was before.
I don't expect you to get it right. I guess I'd like you to put yourself in my shoes so I won't have to explain everything. I'd like to forget about racism just as much as you. The difference is you can, I can't. Who the hell is that?
That's me, silly. Don't you recognize me?
Oh, for Christ's sakes. Not you. Him.
Oh, that's Robert, the assistant DA who handled the case.
What case?
Oh, Brenda pressed charges against Carlos for attempted rape. Okay, open up in there. This is the cops.
And then what happened?
Something woke me up. I didn't know what. I was half asleep and reached over and turned on the light. And there you were, standing beside the bed, bare-ass naked. I started to scream. Maybe I yelled, "Get out of here," I'm not sure. And you said, and I'm not sure of the sequence, "You're very beautiful. I want to talk to you. Don't be afraid." I kept yelling. It all went very fast. My bed is wedged in a corner of the room. I couldn't get out. You were blocking my way. Then you hit me very hard on my left breast. It must have been then that Jenny rang the bell. You immediately ran into the kitchen and must have crawled back across the air shaft into your apartment. All I could think of was getting out of there.
Excuse me. Yes? Yes? Great. That's all we need to know. Let's throw the book at him. He'll never do his filthy act in this town again. Now, you said you'd spoken to him previously in the street. How long before the assault had this taken place?
Wearing my voluminous flannel nightgown, I knelt before the small wood-burning stove, trying to see why the fire was so fragile. I felt huge and awkward in that position, aware of my rump and falling breasts. But the cold night air demanded that the fire be encouraged to burn at a brisker pace. My younger lover, small and tight in her body, sat on the couch watching me. I did not like what I thought she saw. I didn't like the bigness of my ass, the weight of my body on my knees. Then, just as I'd worked very hard to accept my lack of appeal, she said in a low, firm voice, "You look so fuckable that way." I froze, caught in that moment of self-hatred by the clarity of her desire. I stopped all movement, awed once again by the possibilities of life. I knew she was walking toward me. I felt her stand behind me, felt her hand shape my nightgown to my curves. I heard her breath come quicker, and still I didn't move. She grew impatient and reached under the gown, piling up its lengths on her arm like a fisherman pulling in his nets. Then, against all my fear, she entered me. The fire blazed up, and so did my hope, as I finally left the burden behind me and rode her hand with all the grace love had ever given me.
He called me in as a witness for the prosecution. The defense attorney was a real schmuck.
Miss Stowe, do you live in an apartment?
Yes, I do.
What floor is your apartment on, Miss Stowe?
The second floor.
Do your windows face the street, Miss Stowe?
Yes.
Can people on the street see you when you are at your windows, Miss Stowe?
I suppose so.
Yes or no, Miss Stowe?
Yes, I suppose so.
Miss Stowe, did you at any time prior to the incident you have described ever have occasion to appear at your windows?
What do you mean?
I mean just what I said, Miss Stowe.
What does that have to do with anything?
Please answer the question.
Sometimes I wash my windows and sometimes I look out of my windows.
And what did you wear when you washed your windows, Miss Stowe?
For heaven's sake, what difference does it make?
The witness will kindly answer the questions as asked, without commentary.
I wore clothes.
What I'm asking, Miss Stowe, is were you ever in a state of incomplete attire when you washed your windows? In other words, were you indecently dressed?
No, I was not indecently dressed.
What were you wearing, Miss Stowe?
I was wearing a dress. There's this Lenny Bruce shtick. After his performance in a club in a small Midwestern city, a middle-aged couple invited him to have a drink with them at their table. As Bruce put it, the woman was wearing one of them see-through dresses, only you don't wanna. So what do I do now?
Well, that is complicated too, so maybe you could unpack it slightly.
Well, this one has a real plot. It's an African-American documentary filmmaker is making a documentary about menopause and aging, female aging. And she, one of her interviewees is this woman. It seems they knew each other many years before, and so they get into this whole dialogue. Jenny, her name is, doesn't really want to talk about menopause. She finds it a boring subject, and she wants to tell Yvonne Washington, the name of the filmmaker, about an incident that happened when she was a young dancer in New York that actually happened to me. I lived in an all-white building on a Puerto Rican block and in Manhattan, and the guy from next door climbed through my downstairs neighbor's window, and he was drunk, and I don't know, he didn't really want to rape her, but she started screaming, and I ran down, and the cops came, and I was a witness. I was called in by the DA, and had an affair, a very short affair with this DA after the trial was over. So it's about this relationship. It's also the lesbian neighbor downstairs is in that scene where she's talking to and instead of saying he, she says you, I was in a corner and you didn't have any clothes on, and so it's all mixed up, the pronouns and then she tells that story about a seduction with a lover, a female lover, and that's when he butts out his cigarette and he's burned, so to speak, by the story. Then what happens? You see them in bed. The scene goes on. So it's all broken up. There are flashbacks where Jenny plays her younger self as a middle-aged woman. So that's a mix-up going against the grain of conventions. A younger actor playing actress playing the character. And then the Puerto Rican guy is given language of Frantz Fanon, which is a very Godardian thing. I mean, here is a kind of a working class guy who speaks Marx, and the way Godard would put Marx in the mouths of children, and or a sanitation worker, for instance, and so the long monologues about race and the subjectivity of an oppressed black subject, and there are real interviews with. I conducted interviews with menopausal women who talked about menopause, and there documentary footage of doctors. They're all different kinds of source material in the film.
In this film, and then we should probably go and look at the last and then open it to the house, but in this film, I mean, you're essentially not conflating, but putting together all different kinds of otherness, sexual otherness, racial otherness, age-based otherness, and so on. And in what ways are you trying to equate them, or in what ways are you trying to differentiate them?
Both. It's not always clear. That passage with all the printed matter on the computer, this early computer. I think it was my first computer. In the first person, they're not all my stories, but about the encounter on the bus. That was all about race. And then the interviews are all about female aging, and I think in this clip even, we could have watched it further. There's they come to climax, the DA, assistant DA and Jenny in bed, and she rises up out of this reclining position, faces the camera, and she says, the hardest part about reaching middle age was the realization that the linchpin of my identity was being desired by men, which in my own experience and that of other women of my generation, this was something pretty hard to, when men stopped whistling at you if you'd been an attractive woman. And I had to face that to some extent. I mean, I wouldn't have phrased it like that, but the extreme of that struggle is voiced by Jenny to the camera. It's a very powerful moment. So they're kept separate, the race issue and the feminist issue, but then they they come together at various points, and I guess I leave it to the audience to keep them on track. There is an anti-medical thing, but there was. This was before hormone replacement theory was discredited. Therapy was discredited as not being the best thing a woman could do, and there were, of course, an earlier generation of doctors who were pushing it on women, and so there are a lot of statistics about hysterectomies and hormone replacement where in the United States where most hysterectomies happen and medical practices. A lot of information and from women and about medical practice in the 50s, 60s.
Okay, and then we should go to this clip and then we will open up the house. But in recent years, you went back to now not performing dance, but to choreographing dance. Can you explain the circumstance a little bit?
Yeah, my last feature film was 1996, and I realized I had gotten a lot of big grants that had enabled me. Each film cost twice as much as the previous one, and I realized unless I made a crossover into more conventional documentary or narrative filmmaking, I wouldn't be able to go on like this. So raise that kind of money, and I was getting kind of fed up with film production. I found very difficult. It was always a struggle. I felt like I was the dog wagged by the tail, not in control. And so I wrote poetry for a year, and I did various things, and around the end of 1999, Mikhail Baryshnikov invited me to make a dance for his company, and it was an offer I couldn't refuse. I hadn't choreographed for 25 years, but with the help of a dancer who continues to work with me, Pat Catterson, who had studied with me in the late 60s and was still going strong, I raided my icebox and went back to my notebooks, and I pulled together a half-hour work for him. And following that, there were a succession of opportunities and invitations, and I've now made 3 more dances for my own group, which is 4 women. But what I'm going to show you is the last section of a 45-minute work based on the Rite of Spring. And it was culled from a BBC dramatization of the making of the Rite of Spring, which of course was you probably all know, was the scandale of in Paris when Diaghilev's Ballet Russe premiered the Nijinsky-Stravinsky collaboration. And it was reconstructed by a dance historian, choreographer, Millicent Hodson, in the late 80s for the Joffrey Ballet, and taught to the Finnish National Ballet, which performs it at the end of this film, but to a fictionalized, riotous audience that is protesting. So I used the soundtrack from that section of the BBC production, and that's what you will hear in my version of the Rite of Spring, which is called ROS Indexical. Now we have to go fast forward. We're going to go fast forward to that, and I should come down to check it out. Where to stop? Can you do, yeah, let's go very fast. You get a racetrack view of the whole dance. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Whoop! Oh, you have to go back. I'm sorry. Are we going to do it again? I'm sorry. This is more I'll try and stop you. Yeah. 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 No, 30 is too slow. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's do 30 now. We're doing 10 now. Oh, wait, this is, what are they doing? Oh, yeah, I know. Okay, keep going. You can go at 30. Yeah. Where are we? No, you're going just twice. Do 30 or 10, yeah, or 30. I think I can keep track of 30. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay, do 10. Oop, it go. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Yeah, Yeah, with
Okay. Just very quickly, to say one thing about, I asked before about origins of motions, and this came up the other day when we were talking, but there's a scene in the corner, she's doing this, like that, which is straight out of Robin Williams' Live, and it's also a woman doing it, whereas in his case it's a man doing it, so it's an image of oral sex, but you've flipped the genders, and so on and so forth. So built into this are all kinds of subtext and all kinds of other things going on, which are the blend in this case is not just random, it's actually quite programmatic in certain ways, is it not? Could you talk about how the way in which dance now is made for you, in some ways, the way the subtext of the films were done with verbal language and with...
Well, it's all quotation now. I mean, it's not coming out of my body invention. Although some of it could. I mean, I accept, like, the dance that followed this one uses movement by Pat Catterson's senile mother, who's in an assisted living situation. She used to be a professional ballroom dancer, and you put on a 40s Dean Martin record and she can still do her moves, so that's in the dance. I mean, Robin Williams, Steve Martin, a lot of Robin Williams here, but also from Millicent Hudson's reconstruction of the Nijinsky. This stuff is right out of the original, probably quite authentic. The dance of the Virgin, it's about a tribal, Slavic tribal rituals that required a virgin to dance herself to death to bring on spring and the crops. So a lot of her movements are her ecstatic, desperate movements are in there. Yeah.
I will, but you've done a dance called "The Mind is a Muscle," which reminds me of a phrase by Henri Fossillon, who's a French art historian, who talked about the mind and the hand, the things that the body knows. And you've done an autobiography or a memoir called "Feelings Are Facts," in which you essentially say that which is subjective is also objective. And it seems like throughout this work there's a sort of desire not to collapse the oppositions, but to bring them so close to each other that they sort of throw sparks. And is that a kind of overall design of what you've done?
Susan Sontag put it very acutely, I think, radical juxtaposition, which also the theories of the Russian director Eisenstein, a collision of opposites, or seeming opposites, throwing off sparks, or Barth's third meaning. Is it Barth who did the...
Somebody in the room probably knows the answer. Okay,
Yes?
why don't we go to the room now? Come forward with Barth or whatever. We have a mic too, if anybody wants to.
I wanted to get back to something that Rob brought up at the beginning of the discussion, and you were talking about context and the changing social context in which you worked from, say, the 60s up to the present, these various moments as the art world has gone through, obviously, major shifts. And so I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about the question of audience and your own sort of evolving notion of, I guess, two senses of audience, at least two, one of which is how you bring the audience very deliberately into your dances, your films, as just one among many frames that you're dealing with. So this kind of structural use of the notion of audience. But then, in a very general sense, your public, who you're working for, who you're speaking to, and the extent to which that's changed over the decades?
Well, it's always been a pretty specialized audience. People interested in modernist, postmodernist things. But in terms of affecting the work or the creation of the work, that hasn't changed. I have a sense of myself in the audience and what I guess every artist does, what it looks like, right? And even when you're working out of your own body, I was very much attached to a mirror. What did the shape look like? And not everyone, all dancers today don't work that way. They're very often more involved with what it feels like. And or what it is saying. And so the audience is essential because I make something for an audience, and an audience has to be present, unlike a painting in a museum. I mean, it's there whether someone is standing in front of it or not. So you're important to the work, yeah? I don't know whether you're getting at something else.
I guess the question also partly came from having met somebody recently who was trained in the last year or two to do Trio A. And
who's that?
Simon Lung.
Oh, yeah.
I just saw him, recently,
Yeah.
and he was talking about that process, and he's one among, I guess, several people you've worked with, and maybe that's more of a recent thing, who is hardly a trained dancer, and he said
Not
it was
at all.
quite...
He's a tennis player.
Well, I mean, to me, those moves don't actually look easy at all. They look very difficult. And did you initially also work with people who were untrained?
Not initially, no. It was the three of us who first performed it had a lot of training in ballet as well as Cunningham and other techniques. But then by the late 60s, I began to teach it to untrained people. And I just recently taught it at UC Irvine, where I'm employed on the faculty in studio art, and 3 dancers learned it who are in the dance department, and 3 untrained people, a dance historian, an undergrad, and Simon, who's on the faculty. And they performed it together on a program, a faculty dance program. What's the question?
It's what brought me to the question of audience partly. It could be one strategy for broadening your audience, broadening your working context by expanding to beyond trained professional. I guess it comes back to the question of the professionalization of the art world versus maybe this moment in the 60s where it was as you said, everybody saw everything.
Yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to add?
Are we going to de-skill or de-professionalize the art world? I'm not so sure, but way in the back, I think there's somebody.
Hi. So in our modern drama class, we had this very long, in-depth discussion about why you did Trio A, and people were defining art and what you thought was art and why you did it. And that's first half. Second half is, question to first half is, when you very first thought of it or it sparked something in you, like what was that? So like what was that? And second part is, in that same class, we watched it in silence, and there was this whole thing of, she purposely did it in silence because of this, and it meant this. So I just want to know what your thoughts are on that, because you said that it was actually originally done to sound.
Sound.
Yeah, so, yeah, those are my two questions.
Okay, I wanted to make a dance, and I had no overall project. I discovered what it was about as I did it, and that's really all I can say about how it was initiated. And the second part, at first it was in silence, and it has been performed mostly in silence. But I have a little anecdote at the first performance at Judson Church, where the rows of seats are all on the same level as the performance area, and these slats that were thrown out from and piled up on one side of the space. Finally, the guy in the first row picked up one and put his white handkerchief on it and waved it around. Like he was saying, enough already with the...
Yes?
I'm actually, in that same class, and something else that I was wondering about was because so much of what you've done is different from what else exists, starting with Truey and the films that we saw from the 90s. When you're creating, how much of a conscious awareness do you have of the fact that you're doing something different or new or original, and how much of it is just naturally what you feel compelled to do?
I was part of a group that realized there was ground to be broken, new ground to be broken, and we were standing on it. I mean, we were very conscious of breaking with the past and doing new things. So I've always worked out of some kind of polemic. I mean, I have to have an argument in order to proceed, even now, to a certain extent. And that argument is what is like with what I think an audience expects, and I want to, I go with Schoenberg's, I think it was Schoenberg who said, the function of art is to shake you out of your comfort zone, something like that. And I believe that. And so not fulfilling what I perceive as the expectations of an audience. And at that time, the expectations of the dance audience were very clear. They'd been schooled in the American matriarchs of modern dance. And it was these expectations that we were challenging. And another expression I repeat over and over, we were opening up the palace gates of high art and letting in the rabble of, with John Cage, it was the audience coughing, and with my group, it was walking and running. Yeah.
There's one right there in the center, and then we'll get to the back a second. No, first here. Okay,
This.
Sure.
Who, me? Hi.
Oh.
Hi.
Okay.
First of all, I just want to say that I'm an art professional. I'm not. And second of all, I'm sort of interested in. I think that all art has always been professional. I don't think it's a new thing. But I'm really interested in hearing you talk about yourself as an educator and as a teacher. And especially since so much of contemporary practice sort of talks the language of collaboration and the language of community, and it really has nothing to do with either one of those things. It really has to do with a specific goal, a specific shape, a specific thing. So I just want you to talk a little bit about that, and also how you make decisions in terms of crafting a dance.
In terms of what?
In terms of crafting a dance or crafting
Craft.
movement.
Well, in what you saw, I'll deal with the last first. The decisions were based on this reconstruction of a dance. I mean, I was stealing, copying. We recreated as much as we could from that BBC film. And where the camera cut away to the audience, then I put in my own stuff. So it varied. Sometimes at one point the dancers pretend to throw rocks at the audience. At others we did Robin Williams stuff, right? So I'm always, the craft, I don't follow any rules about craft, you know. It's really about keeping something going, making decisions about duration. That certainly has changed over the years. Yeah, how long, how much do you repeat? How much collision of different kinds of things you do at any one moment. And now I've forgotten the first part of your, teaching. Yeah, I teach a performance workshop at UC Irvine. And depending on who's in it, I try and get a mix of people, from dancers to visual artists. I would like to get some theater people. The schedules are always conflicting. So depending on what is brought into the class, and I give assignments, show videos, I reading. The idea is to extrapolate performance bites or bits from what we read and what we look at. And depending on what these bits are, I stage them at the end of the quarter, and sometimes we have a performance. So I warn people at the beginning, this course is not going to make you into a performance artist.
There was a yes right there.
Yeah,
in the middle.
this one.
Third row in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, I'm okay. No, we're taping it. Thank you. Okay, that's great. So, I have a question. Looking from, I have a question. So, looking from Trio A to this last Rite of Spring dance, Trio A seems very sort of Cunningham-y, like it looks
Very
like
what?
I don't know. I made up that word.
What was the word you used?
Cunningham-y.
Oh, Cunningham-y. Oh my God.
It seems very like body shape in space, not like a clear story being told from beginning to end. Whereas the Rite of Spring really does look like it has much more of an obvious story to tell. Was that something that happened over your career that you just discovered through film?
No. I mean, Rite of Spring is a story.
Right.
Yeah, and I never had dealt with stories in my dance before, but I was interested in these moments of rupture, previous avant-garde moments of rupture with preceding modes of practice. And the Nijinsky threw off the toe shoes, he took away the turnout, they turn in, he took away the elevation, they crouch, etc. And that's what caused the scandal. I mean, it just violated every classical precept that the audience came in with. So I'm interested in those moments, and this was one of them. The preceding dance was based on Balanchine's Agon, which not so radically, but it too was a moment. It was an abstract ballet with no story, and 1957, and so I based a dance on that. What else were you asking?
Well, it was just sort of a question.
Cunningham. Trio A is Cunningham-esque. That's interesting. I mean, the use, what you see is some reference to classical use of the legs, isolation of the leg and the hip, and a certain amount of turnout, the ronde de jambes, but The pedestrian nature of it and the continuity are very different from Cunningham. But my training, yeah, you're very astute. I mean, some of that training shows up there, yeah.
Parenthetically, Cunningham turns 90 this week.
Yeah, yeah. Still going strong.
Hi, I appreciate your allowing the students to see a range, because that's so rare in this country. I had heard in a dance collection of video, I think living in California somewhere. I'm wondering if you know about that and if it's still ongoing, because I think some of the people in the audience were surprised at what the year was. What you mentioned was notice the costumes, but also notice the movement was something that was way pre-rapper and all that. So having this collection is an incredibly important resource to have available, especially since our arts budgets have almost disappeared. So when I have taught, I've usually given 100 examples, so people didn't have an example. One, this is only five things. This is contemporary dance. They would see this range, and they were amazed at this range over decades of movement that would be strongly emotional or just fantastical or surprising or humorous. This range that is part of only a tiny percentage of the population knows about. So before high school ends, because a lot of kids don't go to even high school in Massachusetts, a quarter of them don't even graduate high school anymore. See, middle school to high school to allow for collections of what you said, these bits. If you would support that idea and maybe go to this place where they are collecting this archive.
You're asking where these can be
a few years ago, someone was spearheading a supposed many years long plan to collect and house and archive and change the files as they needed to be digitally changed. But what they didn't have was the idea of incorporating bits on sort of, basically CDs, now DVDs, to allow the middle school and the high school age, when they could not have possibly afford a dance class, but at least an exposure.
Well, Trio A is distributed on a 2-disc package distributed by the Video Data Bank in Chicago. It can be rented or bought. My films are all distributed by Zeitgeist Films in New York. And they're all on DVD. The recent dances are not available. Maybe at some point I should get them into the Performing Arts Library in New York and any other place where, I'll have to attend to that.
One last question and then call it an evening.
I have 2 questions. First question is regarding postmodernism. After 40 years of a practice, what is in your mind the singularity of a postmodernism? Is it a dropping of a metaphor, dropping of the hierarchical elements in your work? How would you define the postmodernism after 40 years of practice? Is it a dropping of a metaphor? Are you giving up on metaphors? And then the second question is you quoted
That's for you to answer.
Schoenberg about shaking yourself out of the comforts. Now, after so many years of postmodernism, is it a time to kind of shake off again? What is your take now? Am I making any sense?
First of all, Rob will define postmodernism.
I will intercede at this point. and simply say that there is by no means consensus on what modernism is, therefore there can be no consensus on what postmodernism is. Let me just read something of Yvonne's with her permission, which actually might address this and might be also a way to sort of tie some threads together. She commented on Cage's relationship to Schoenberg, with whom Cage studied when he was very young, and says the following: each successive generation desires and tries to demolish or break through the wall that its predecessors have devised. Thus, Schoenberg's 12-tone row becomes Cage's silence. De Kooning's gesture becomes Rauschenberg's erasure. Cunningham's arabesque becomes Steve Paxton's walk. It is not for me to describe my own strategies for the benefit of younger artists' challenges. In fact, it is unclear to me whether the present generation is is putting its head against the wall or writing on that wall. And I guess maybe that's in one way of sort of asking the question of what postmodernism is, at least editorially from my point of view, of whether we have shifted from commentaries upon things to actually challenges to things. In kind.
There's one more here.
One more.
I watched Murder and Murder recently, and what I thought was really interesting was that, especially compared to these, is that in that movie, instead of challenging the conventions of, just everything, it seemed like you were using conventions from different places, like literary conventions and playwriting conventions, to challenge the conventions of movies. And the one thing that struck me was, the conventions of movie making is designed to create a clarity of storytelling in that medium. And I was curious how you view the importance of clarity of communication.
Of what?
Clarity of communication.
Clarity of communication.
Yeah, because sometimes I think, I guess as an artist myself, I sometimes worry when I challenge conventions that I am not actually giving as much to people. Because some of what I'm giving is simply a challenge rather than actually saying what it is I mean to say. I mean,
that's always that's part of the decision making. What do you think is important to make clear, and what doesn't need to be made clear? Those are decisions all all along the way. So. But as far as the conventions go, the story in Murder and Murder is about a relationship of two women who get together late in life. And it's the first time I wrote real dialogue. And so there's that convention. I actually develop a psychological relationship between two people. And that's clear. There's scenes with tension, their own kind of tension. But in the challenge in that film is to to naturalism. I mean, in every scene, something is a little askew, like the two ghosts. There are two extraneous characters who, one is the deceased mother of one, a ghost, and the other is the adolescent incarnation of the other one. So these two replicate the audience of the film, and they're constantly looking and commenting on the relationship of the two women. And it was a way of getting humor into it. And so the clarity of the relationship is there, I think. But then, sometimes their dialogue occurs on a stage, and the two ghosts applaud after some emotional interchange between them, as though it's a play. And other times the scene is intact without that kind of framing, but it's cut in a weird way. The continuity match cutting is violated. One reason I quit, I couldn't see making a totally believable or illusionistic kind of narrative film. And I should invoke Brecht here about distanciation. My idea is, and it's important when you're doing this kind of thing, to always know when you're pushing the audience away, where they cease identifying, become aware of the filmmaking production, the production itself, and when you draw them in to identify with the situation or the characters. And I'm constantly doing that in that film.
I would just offer that to speak that way of clarity presumes that clarity is, one, absolutely desirable, and two, possible. And one could, I think, reasonably say that most things are unclear, and that they are as unclear in the viewer as they are unclear in the author, that to be articulate as an author is to address those complexities in the viewer with a kind of trust and involvement that the viewers are not accustomed to being given. And I would just say, this is sort of encomium, that what Yvonne has done in an amazing degree has been articulate, not clear, but articulate about things that are not clear, and been able to blend realities which are psychosexual, which are political, which are formal, which are purely physical. All of these things, each in its own way, is articulate, and to the degree that they're simultaneous, they can be perceived in their own right, but always in connection.
Thank you.
Thank you.